And joining us now for more insight is Alexei Muravyev, Associate Professor of National Security and Strategic Studies at Curtin University. Professor Alexei, thank you so much for joining us. Moscow saying it is prepared to negotiate over the Ukraine war. Given the different demands on both sides and the current critical stage of Kyiv's depleted military that's awaiting new supplies of weapons from the U.S., how will this meeting shape the next trajectory of the conflict in Ukraine?
Well, I think it would very much depend on how convincing Putin is going to be in selling his story to Xi Jinping, given the fact that China may end up attending the international conference on potential peace settlement in Switzerland concerning a potential settlement of this conflict in Ukraine. And given the fact that Russia hasn't been invited, so China may actually be some sort of a backdoor for the Russians to express their opinions, to express their views. For a long time, the Chinese were trying to effectively say that they're interested in a peace settlement, the end of hostilities, because obviously it's bad for their business, and they also don't want to see strategic depletion of the current international world order that may affect them negatively. But given the fact that the Russians accelerated their offensive in Ukraine and continue to achieve success after success, they remain in control of the situation. They hold strategic initiative. I think it would be easier for Putin to actually tell Xi Jinping that Russia is prepared to negotiate peace terms, but on its terms. And I think it's really important for the Chinese to know that Russia is not going to lose, but more likely to win, or at least come out of this conflict stronger than weaker.
And you were talking about China's neutrality earlier. The 12-point peace plan that was proposed by Beijing, that is still on the table. But Beijing risks facing sanctions after the US and EU accuse Beijing of supplying tech that is essential to this war. So how do you think Mr. Xi is managing his priorities or balancing this act? Because his recent trip to Europe was seen as a charm offensive on the back of a sluggish economy back home.
Well, it's obviously a dilemma for the Chinese, and I think that would also be part of the conversations between the Russian delegation and the Chinese delegation. I mean, it's not very rosy for Russia. For example, some Chinese banks, fearing being sanctioned as part of international sanctions regime imposed on Russia, have imposed restrictions on transactions in national currencies between them and the Russian counterparts, and the Russians feeling quite uneasy about this. So I think that would be part of the conversation, and that story alone also highlights this ambiguity that surrounds Chinese standing on this matter. Yes, the Chinese do not condemn Russia's actions, but they don't come out and openly support Russia either. We need to remember that when Russia annexed Crimea, Putin expected Xi Jinping to come out and throw his political support behind it, because at that time he was making signals saying that Russia may join China and support China on its stance vis-a-vis South China CFS. Nothing like that emerged from Beijing. So I think the Russians would probably want to hear a bit more clarity on from the Chinese. And we also need to be mindful that what China is doing, it's not providing military supplies to Russia. It allows Russia to acquire technologies, capabilities, and effectively filling in gaps that were created as a result of withdrawal of Western companies setting up their business in Russia. For example, car manufacturing is a prime example. Right. But there are points that would need to be discussed between the two countries, including China's restrictions, self-imposed restrictions of what they do with the Russians.
Okay, so it's been more than 2 years since both leaders declared a no-limits partnership in an apparent display to push back against what some may describe as America's bullying and interference. What would be the biggest test to their relations? Are there any limits to Mr. Putin's limitless, so-called limitless friendship with Mr. Xi?
Well, clearly there are limits. China stands on the war in Ukraine, the fact that China doesn't throw itself unconditionally back in Russia, for example, the way how North Korea does, is a demonstration of its limits. Clearly, Russia would have limits on how far it's prepared to support China beyond political and symbolic statements with regards to Taiwan dilemma or South China Sea dispute. I think both countries understand that whilst they may be talking about no limits friendship, they haven't signed any mutually binding treaties. Also because they've got individual political agendas, and those individual agendas may not necessarily reflect or be in the interests of the other parties. So, whilst we may be hearing a lot about limitless friendship, but limitless friendship doesn't mean unconditional alliance. And I think that point needs to be understood.
Professor Alexei, I want to bring in the U.S. into the picture. You know, the elections are just months away. We're looking at Biden and Trump really neck and neck in the race. How do you see China and Russia relations progress under a reappointed Biden or a reappointed Trump?
Look, I think I would probably answer this question from a slightly different angle. Both countries have a common understanding that they want to see the end of the US international rules-based order. This is how they look at it. They don't look at it as an international rules-based order. They're effectively saying those rules and norms were set up by Washington. We don't want to see them. So they want to bury the unipolar world concept. They want to create some sort of sense of multipolarity, whether it's a tripod, meaning Washington, Beijing, Moscow, or whether other partners would be allowed to join. And it's a bit unclear with regards to whether it's Trump in the office or Biden in the office. Both of them demonstrated different approaches to both China as well as Russia. So for the Russians, the open confrontation with the United States is likely to continue, whether it's going to be Biden, whether it's going to be Trump. With regards to China, the situation is different because we're talking about not an open military political standoff rather than some sort of a trade war. And I don't really see there's going to be a lot of difference between the two. So I don't think the Chinese or the Russians would kind of have hopes that if there's going to be a reshuffle in the Oval Office in Washington, it's going to be good news for them. I think both of them have agreed to actually play together against the United States, and this is what also brings them together with regards to contemporary international affairs.
Professor Alexei, always great to chat with you. Thank you so much for your analysis. That was Alexei Muraviev, Associate Professor of National Security and Strategic Studies from Curtin University.